Good evening. My name is Dick Quinn, and I've been the Sports Information Director here at Williams since 1989. I'd like to say a few words about the awards being presented this evening. When I began at Williams 34 years ago, I was terrified of having to rely on students so much, but within a few weeks, I was in my boss, Jim Colasar's office, asking to create an award because of the phenomenal production by these students. Frank Deford is my all-time favorite sports writer. Perhaps many of you would know him from his work in Sports Illustrated, or the books he has written, or his sports minutes on NPR that created many driveway moments. I wanted to name the award after Frank Deford. Frank and I shared a love for the color purple and a love for our daughters, both of whom had cystic fibrosis and left us way too soon. Through a Williams connection, there's always a Williams connection, I obtained Frank's personal number. There were no cell phone numbers back then. After my family and I spent some time in his Connecticut home, Frank agreed to come and present the first award in 1990. Frank came back several times over the years. He also received an honorary degree from Williams and a National Humanities Medal from President Barack Obama. This is an historic night for Eph Sports Information. We are honoring 10 outstanding students, which is a record. You can clap. The Deford Award honors outstanding achievement in writing, photography, and statistics. The Aaron Pinsky 06 Student Broadcasting Award honors color commentators. Aaron Pinsky was a passionate and talented broadcaster of Williams athletic events, a top-notch student, and a wonderful musician. Two of Aaron's friends, Mike Needham and Zach Ullman, asked me in the fall of 2009 if an award could be created in Aaron's name so he would know he would never be forgotten at Williams. Mike and Zach were able to tell Aaron about the Pinsky Award before Aaron passed away from an incurable form of brain cancer. In April of 2010, the first Pinsky Award was presented. The Pinsky Award is determined by reviewing webcasts and consulting personnel from the Northeast Sports Network, NSN, for nominations. Unfortunately, the Pinsky family is unable to attend this evening, but they assured me they will be back next year. Now to the awards. Our first Pinsky Award is Grace Collier. Some people know Grace as a midfielder on the women's lacrosse team. I know her to be an outstanding color commentator on field hockey. Grace assured me that she knew the game of field hockey when hired. Our webcast producer, Northeast Sports, struggles to find play-by-play people for field hockey and wrestling, so it's most helpful to have a student color commentator who knows the sport. The first game Grace worked, I stood in the bottom level of the portable press box at Williamson Field so I could listen to her up above. After about 5 minutes of game action, she was carrying the broadcast, and the NSN broadcaster was generous enough to let her do it. And she just got better and better as the season progressed.
Thank you.
Our second Pinsky honoree is senior Nikhil Ostrander, who lettered in football playing on the offensive line. I hired Nikhil to be the student color commentator for baseball. The first game I watched to assess his talents was an eye-opener. The camera, the play-by-play person, and the color commentator are in center field, some 400 feet from home plate. I don't remember who was pitching for the Ephs that day, but the first batter he faced was called out on strikes, and Nikhil noted it was a nasty slider that clipped the inside corner. A few innings later, I checked with one of his teammates, football teammates, who was working stats for the game and was sitting near home plate. I just wanted to see if Nikhil knew what he was calling a slider and a curve. I was assured that he was on target. As the season progressed, Nikhil added more and more statistical information on the Eph team above and beyond anyone prior to his arrival. Nikhil Ostrander. Now I will present 5 Frank Deford Awards. Our first 2023 Deford Award winner is sophomore Nick Alcock. In the fall of his first year and his sophomore year, Nick has been a practice player for the men's soccer team. This year, Nick signed on as an in-game highlights person, and he soon became our authority on the subject. Nick was quick to sort out issues with the webcasts and the capturing of highlights. He is now the #1 trainer of highlights folks. We use what is called an M3U8 link to capture highlights. When men's soccer was to play in the NCAA semifinals and finals in Roanoke, Virginia, I called down to Roanoke to get an M3U8 link for the semifinal game. I was a bit surprised to find out that there wouldn't be an M3U8 link. When I relayed that information to Nick, he said he would do some digging. Lo and behold, he got back to me the next day and said, "No worries, I can pull from YouTube." Nick does not see obstacles, he sees opportunities for providing solutions. One side note coming up later about that event. So junior Jamie Cates is our next Deford honoree. Jamie plays on the Eve men's ice hockey team, and late this past season he ended up serving as a student coach for the team. Currently, Jamie is the writer for Eve men's lacrosse. Before he helped coach the Eve ice hockey team, Jamie was the team's replacement writer for stories to be posted on our website. One night after a home game, he texted me he was on his way to the Berkshire Medical Center to get an injury checked out. He assured me that he would write and post the story before he saw a doctor. And he did. That's dedication. Just to be clear, all these stories are true. Senior Jacob Fink is our next honoree. Jacob is a Williamstown resident who has loved Williams men's basketball since he was in grade school. When I learned of his interest in writing the men's basketball game stories, I was concerned that he might be too into it. So I spoke to him about that, and we agreed that if he got carried away because of his long and dedicated support of Eve men's basketball, a change would be needed. To his credit, Jacob did a remarkable job covering Eve men's basketball for the past 3 years. He also enlisted some Eve students to work on a season-long video about the 2022-23 season. Junior Eamon Garrigrady is our next honoree. Don't go away. This is where the one side note comes in. When you are the sports information director and you walk by a coach's office and that coach comes rushing out to say that he wants to talk to you about his writer, you stop and listen. What wrestling coach Scott Honecker said to me 2 years ago about Eamon is what I had hoped to hear. Scott told me he thoroughly enjoyed working with Eamon, appreciated his dedication, and he wanted to keep him as his writer for as long as Eamon wanted to be on the job. Eamon covered wrestling for the 2nd year this year, and I'm hoping he's in for the 3rd year, and these are my witnesses. Can we count on you? Yeah. So here's the side note, and this is Williams only kind of thing. Through the heroics of Nick Alcock to get the national men's soccer semifinal and final highlights on our web pages, many Eve fans were able to see Eamon's perfect left-footed cross to Nick Boardman, who headed home the game-winning goal in the semifinal contest. That's teamwork. At this time, I would like to have Trevor Wenners, the Manager of Athletic Statistics and Record Keeping, to come forward to present the 3 Deford Awards to members of his stat crews.
All right, so my name is Trevor Wenners, and I'm the Manager of Athletic Statistics and Record Keeping here at Williams College. Like Dick Quinn said, I will be introducing my 3 student workers who are Deford winners for the 2022-2023 athletic year. They have helped me immensely with compiling statistics this year at Williams College sporting events and have represented the college in tremendous ways. First is Jordan Brazy. Jordan is the type of worker that you always know is all in on whatever she is doing. She approaches each game with a great attitude, is excited to get the job done the right way, and works very well as a team. She comes early and prepared. She picks up things extremely quickly, studies on her own time, and is extremely reliable and always available. You can tell she truly enjoys being a part of the stats team because some weeks she will need a reminder to report her hours. She does her work for the pure joy of being involved in sports and represent Williams as opposed to viewing it as an actual job. This spring is Jordan's first time maintaining stats for baseball and lacrosse, and she has hit the ground running immediately. She has a great attention to detail. She double-checks goals and assists for soccer and ice hockey on film and goes the extra mile in every way possible. She takes being a part of the stats team as kind of like another class and is committed in every way. She is also open to taking instruction and learning new things, 2 invaluable skills in today's world. Congratulations, Jordan. All right, our second honor for Stats Award is Drew Mupiti. Thank you. Volleyball is no question, in my opinion, the toughest sport to keep stats for. At all my previous jobs, I struggled to find student workers who could excel at keeping volleyball stats. When I first joined Williams, I was extremely concerned about leaving students to do volleyball stats by themselves. But that fear was quickly erased with Drew's ability to excel in this role. I remember watching the first game of the season remotely because I was not on campus yet, and keeping the stats myself as a backup. Quickly, I realized this was not necessary because Drew was on point on everything. His ability to keep up with the pace of volleyball and basketball as an inputter is impressive, but also his attention to detail is second to none. He will always go back and double-check his work and make notes of things that need to be corrected later. Congratulations, Drew. Thank you. All right, last but not least is Max Hart. The best way I can describe Max is a great leader. He is very confident in his abilities and holds himself to a very high standard and is a pleasure to work with. He is committed to getting things done the right way no matter what that means. If there was a position available called stats team leader, he would be this for football, no question. His understanding of football stats is phenomenal, probably because he is from Texas. He is always on point on everything, exact yardage, type of penalty, participation, and who made the tackle, while also overseeing the inputter to make sure what he is saying is going into the software correctly. During the first home football game, I remember expecting the need to get involved with calling stats and correcting some issues, but Max knew everything that needed to be done and more. Max is the type of person that is very skilled at organizing, communicating, and adjusting to adverse situations. Not having Max available in the spring sports season due to the fact that he's a part of the baseball team is tough because he is someone who is very hard to fill his shoes. Max puts his full effort into anything he is doing and is someone who is laser focused on the task at hand. You never have to worry about Max missing a play or getting distracted. I do not think his eyes leave the field at all during the game. He is a model student worker. Congratulations, Max.
I saved this award for last, and you'll see why. Our next Ford Award winner is Senior Gigi Buckner. Gigi excelled as a student office worker, writer of player and coach profiles, and as a valuable contributor to our Instagram efforts over the last 3 years. There's more. In addition, she has also served on multiple in-game stat crews. Gigi even spent one summer working for Eph Sports Info, where she updated record books, bios, schedules, and rosters. She has been an invaluable asset in so many ways. I cannot thank her enough. Thank you. I'd like to ask Williams President Maud Mandel to come forward for some special recognition. As we all know, Maud has done a most remarkable job in leading Williams through the pandemic and introducing the first of its kind financial aid plan that does not require Eph students to take out loans. What you might not know is that President Mandel recently participated in the softball team's Take a Professor to Practice event, where professors actually participate in some of the softball team drills, like fielding grounders and taking batting practice. Maud has been a great sport and a great supporter of all our student athletes, and I have 2 gifts for her.
Oh, just what I need, another purple t-shirt.
You do need this one. Say anything? Okay.
No. So a little off the cuff, I wasn't actually expecting any gifts myself. I'm really here to cheer on the many folks who are being celebrated tonight and to wish you a tremendous congratulations. It's really wonderful. One of the parents in the room said this is the beginning of the very long number of celebrations we do at the end of the year to recognize so many contributions of Williams students as we get towards the end of the year. And so it's really exciting to be with you. I particularly love these awards because they really bring together the scholar-athlete story that we have here of writing and stats and athletics all together. It's really a Williams story. And so it's really exciting to be here. And in fact, I'm often on the road this time. This is this time of year, and so this is the first time I've been able to come to this particular ceremony. So it's been really exciting to do so. Last thing I just want to say is, since I got the podium, I'd really love to do a big shout out to Dick Quinn, who is a legend at Williams. So. Thank you.
So, Maud, that check I gave you cleared? It's now my great pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Chris Clary. Chris is a 1986 graduate of Williams, and he played some tennis and soccer for the Ephs. Currently, Chris writes sports for the New York Times, where he's covered 14 Olympic Games. Chris has covered global sports for the New York Times for over 30 years. Most recently, he wrote an international bestseller about tennis great Roger Federer, The Master, The Long Run, and Beautiful Game of Roger Federer. That book has been translated into 19 different languages. Chris has written about some 60 different sports in his career, and has covered everything from World Track and Field Championships to the British Open, the America's Cup, the NBA Finals, the Super Bowl, and bullfighting. In 2018, Chris received the Eugene L. Scott Award from the International Tennis Hall of Fame, and he is also a past winner of the Associated Press Sports Editors Contest in the Breaking News category. And yes, there's more, but our student athletes have homework, so I'll stop here. Chris Clary.
Wow. Been a long time since I was at Williams. I guess I wanted to start with a question. About almost 40 years ago, I lost my shoe. I hear somebody laughing over there. Brad Bissell might remember this, actually. We were playing shoe golf. Anybody play shoe golf still on campus at Williams? Shoe golf's when you take your shoe and you hurl it like this off your foot and try to get distance like you would with a drive in golf. And you play, your course of your choosing. It was the morning of graduation. We decided to play shoe golf. And I made a bad drive and my shoe ended up on the roof of Morgan. So we've been waiting for 40 years for the damn thing to drop. So if anybody's seen it, please bring it back to me if you can. That would be great. It's great to be here. A lot of great memories here. First of all, I want to say thanks to Dick Quinn for tracking me down. It's never easy to do. And to be part of this illustrious evening. It's a great tradition here. Any prize-winning ceremony that has Frank Deford involved, I want to be part of as a sports writer. The guy was justifiably a legend, a real craftsman, a real wordsmith, and amazing to be part of that sort of experience. And Dick, I was just going to say, your approach to things, your love of Williams and your love of sports and your job just comes through in everything that you do. And your positive energy is positively contagious. So thank you for that. And so the reason we're all here tonight is for the award winners, and I want to say congratulations. I feel your pain. I was working in Williams Sports Information myself when I was at Williams. I spent all 4 years working in there for a tougher taskmaster than Dick, I imagine, a guy named Seth Johnson, who had a tough red pen. He would do a lot of correcting on your work. So helped me down the road. But I know how hard it is to juggle everything. I don't think I succeeded very well in my time, but I'm amazed that you guys do as well as you do. So, and I also know as a former Williams athlete how much the families and the teams and the athletes appreciate the work that you do and how much it means to everybody. So, bravo to you. So I haven't been back much. I graduated in '86, so it's been almost 37 years since I graduated. I've only been back a couple times. So a few things have understandably changed in my life during that period. I have been married for over 30 years. I've got 3 children. 2 of them are fully grown, wholly solvent adults. I have another one who's 17, hopefully will follow the same path. I drink a lot less beer now than I used to, which is probably a good thing. Got a lot more gray hair, a lot less hair in general, I would say. And, I've definitely had a lot of chance to travel around the world since I was here at Williams. I lived for a long time in Paris. My wife is French. Lived for a long time in Seville, Spain. And I also learned some languages along the way, more or less. And I became fluent in jet lag, unfortunately, as my friends could attest. I've fallen asleep in mid-sentence at times when I've been back from the Australian Open. So massive jet lag from Australia. I have definitely had issues with waking up in hotel rooms on occasion, not knowing where I am in the middle of a long road trip. That's quite an experience. I'm not sure I even knew what country I was in at times as well. But it was definitely a great experience for sure. And as Dick mentioned, I've covered a lot of different sporting events over the years. 14 Olympics and 6 World Cups in soccer, 5 for the men, 1 for the women just recently, which I really enjoyed. And I guess the craziest thing, if you think about it, after all these years, is I've covered over 100 Grand Slam tennis tournaments now, which sounds kind of cool, but then you think about it, I basically have spent or wasted 4 full years of my life watching tennis balls go across nets. And I'll leave it to you to judge whether that's a worthy use of your time or not. I can say for me, it's really been a privilege to do it. People have often asked me, I've been doing my job for almost 40 years, why did you stay in sports? Why do you still do sports? You write about anything. And I always say, well, sports has everything in it. It really touches all aspects of society. It touches all aspects of the world in which we live at one time or another. And I think that's what's kept me in it. And basically, it's a bit like, I always compare it to art or music. It's a global thing. It's a global need. Everywhere you go in the world, people care about sports, not always the same ones. And that makes it sort of endlessly fascinating and a great passport to the world. And the sport that I've always gravitated to the most is tennis. And not the most mainstream sport in the US these days, but I feel like tennis is also really global, which is the cool thing about it. The champions come from all over the world. Every continent except Antarctica has produced a good player over the years. And it's something that I think is a sport that is extremely mental. It's a real challenge. People call it boxing without blood, which is an interesting comparison. I would call it sort of a chess when you're on the move, chess on the run. You're always having to think about ways to unlock the tactics, unlock the safe, and win the point. And I also think that tennis players, in my experience, are really highly underrated athletes. I say that because I was a former tennis player, maybe too, but also I feel like having watched the guys at the highest levels, I don't know how many of you actually follow tennis, but Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, young guy coming up named Carlos Alcaraz from Spain, who's amazing. These guys, in my opinion, if you look at the whole package, are, I think, among the best athletes in the world at what they do, and any sport, if you chose it. You have to have a mixture of explosion, you have to have a mixture of quickness, you have to have a mixture of hand-eye coordination. You got to be able to tactically shift, think on the run. So I would compare them to NBA players, or I would compare them to skill position players in the NFL. I would really rate them in that same kind of level, yeah, that sort of thing. So for me, a lot has changed, but a couple things have not changed since I was here at Williams. I guess you could say 37 years ago, I came here and I'm still hanging out with the same person. My roommate, Doug Roby, who's here tonight. So I guess what I'd say is be very careful who you talk to during freshman orientation, because it might be for life. Doug was a very good athlete at Williams, All-American in squash, and though I spent all of my time in the library beavering away, and I mean all of it, I heard that Doug actually could organize a pretty good party back in his day too. You can confirm or deny that, I don't know. But Doug was in Williams F, and I was in Williams E, and we met on the very first day, I think, of school, heading down to the field house, and we struck up a conversation, and in many ways I feel like our conversation has never ended over the last 4 years. It just kept on going. And Doug and I were really, really good friends in college, but we really got to know each other the year after college. And we decided to take our degrees and our summer money that we had earned and travel around the world for the better part of the year. So we took off. We went through Western Europe. Only stop was in East Berlin then, which was still behind a wall. Went through Middle East, went through Asia, and traveled through countries like Israel and Egypt, Thailand, Burma, China, Japan. It was an amazing year, really, in a lot of ways, and it was a year of postgraduate education without having to take any classes, which was kind of nice. And we laughed, we cried, we argued a lot. We sometimes even agreed. We got sick, really sick, both times. Doug got sick in Hong Kong, I got sick in Burma, and we recovered. But we bonded above all through all of this, and we got through it. And we also, I think, took more forms of transport than I knew ever existed in the course of the journey. Trains, planes, automobiles, tuk-tuks, motorcycles, mopeds, canoes, camels. But I think the thing I remember the most these days was a trishaw. Anybody know what a trishaw is? Trishaw is like a rickshaw, but it's got a bicycle on the front. So it's basically a three-wheeled thing, very big in Asia. So Doug and I were traveling in China. This is 1987. The country had just opened up to independent travelers. It was kind of in the middle of a huge shift and transition to a more open economy. And we decided to travel through the country on our own. Got a visa and went in. We got off at the train station in a city called Wuhan. And we were going to catch a ferry there. At the time, and still, neither one of us speaks any Mandarin. Our only way of getting around the country was, in those days of the pre-internet, was with a Lonely Planet guidebook and a Lonely Planet phrasebook, which are still pretty useful, but they were really necessary then. So we get off the train, and my recall is that we kind of had to get to the ferry, and there wasn't a whole lot of time, so we had weren't sure how to get there, so we decided we'd use the try-shot. We found this older guy, probably in his 70s, who had a bare chest, and he had his vehicle and was waiting by the train station. So we showed him our Lonely Planet guidebook with the map, and he looked at it for quite a while, and he nodded his head and pointed to the back of his try-shot. So Doug and I sit down. Each one of us has got a really heavy backpack. So we sit down, and the 70-year-old guy starts pedaling through the streets of Wuhan to take us to our ferry. And we're like, this is a pretty short trip, so it shouldn't be a problem. It wasn't a short trip. 10 minutes go by, the guy is still pedaling. 20 minutes go by, and the guy is still pedaling. 30 minutes, the guy's pedaling, and now he's really sweating. He's going up hills, coming down hills, doing the whole thing. And Doug and I are sitting in the back starting to feel kind of guilty about this. Here we are, two guys in the prime of life, and this guy is 70 years old having to take us through the streets of Wuhan. But we can't do anything because we can't communicate. I don't know how long it took, but we finally ended up at the ferry landing. We gave him for us, which was a big tip, and we realized what had happened. We had gotten off one stop too early on the way to the train. And so he had to go like an extra 2 or 3 miles to make it to where he had to go. So the morals of the story there, I would say, are learn the languages if you're going to travel anywhere for that kind of time. 2, people are inherently good, as I think we learned throughout our trip. People generally will do the right thing for you, as that guy did for us. And number 3, I'd say, is Google Maps are not evil. I think technology has made traveling a lot better and a lot easier in some ways. But it was a learning experience, and that whole trip was a learning experience for us. It was something that I think changed both of our lives in a major way, and we were able to really kind of connect through it, and it brought us together, for life. Doug was best man at my wedding. Doug is my children call him Uncle. When they came back from Europe to live, we ended up becoming neighbors again. So I would say, just as to warn you again, be very careful who you talk to at freshman orientation, because it could have consequences. Other thing that hasn't changed for me during my time away from Williams is that I'm still writing on deadline, 37 years later. I was then and I am now. Back in the day, it was, at least the first couple of years of Williams, it was an electric typewriter with a correction ribbon. And basically you had to, when you finished, print it out in a big hurry, sprint across the campus. It was always across the campus to your professor's box and drop off the paper. I always had at least a minute or 2 to spare before I did it. And then there was that walk back to your room, which was always the best walk of all time. I'm not sure I've been that relieved ever since. As a New York Times reporter, the tools have changed. You've got a laptop, featherweight, you've got spell check, your syntax can be checked, your grammar can be checked. Pretty soon the computer's going to write the story for you probably, the way things are going. And you can basically file your story with a couple of different keystrokes. But in essence, the spirit of it all is still the same. You are writing on adrenaline, on a surge of adrenaline. And if I'm honest about it, you're writing because of the surge of adrenaline in a lot of ways. I think I've been sort of addicted to that kind of pressure and that kind of deadline writing for a long time. I've been writing under pressure like that since I was in my teens. You can call it procrastination. That's kind of a nasty word. I'd rather go with compartmentalization. That sounds better to me. Why would you want to, write your story when you have this opportunity to go and look in your drawers and rearrange the socks? Why would you want to write your story right now when you have a HBO limited series that's limited and you want to be able to watch to get through it? Until the adrenaline really starts to pump. And the adrenaline definitely does pump. I've been kind of rushing myself through stories since Williams' time, and I think ultimately it's really not a coincidence that I chose to be a print journalist and really a daily journalist, because it was a good fit. Because you can procrastinate, I mean you can compartmentalize, but only for a little while. Daily journalism means daily story, at least it used to. And I spent a lot of my career writing at least once a day, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, and back in the day in the Grand Slam tournament, sometimes 4 articles a day. People always ask, do you ever get writer's block? And I always say, I never had time to get writer's block. And that's very true. I think you'd ask most sports writers that. Not a lot of writer's block in sports writing. So I think it was a good fit for that reason. And I think another reason it was a good fit, I'm no psychologist or a psychology expert, but I would describe myself as an extro-introvert. I don't know if any of you describe yourselves that way. But it's because I love people. I love meeting new friends, traveling around, talking to folks, having that communication. But then I need my downtime. I need my ability to kind of go back, process everything, kind of get back in my own headspace and kind of absorb it all before I go back out in the world again. And journalism is that. You're reporting out in the field, the interviews, all that face-to-face time, that's for the extrovert. But then you get your creation time. And you go back, go through your notes, go through your research, and you get that sort of processing moment where you can kind of break away from it all. And that's for the introvert. And that duality is, I know a lot of journalists who are like that. So those of you who are doing this sports information, if you're like that, think about that, because that's a character trait that a lot of journalists possess. I would say since I was pretty little, pretty young, I knew I wanted to write for a living. It wasn't the only thing I was interested in, but I knew that was something that I was interested in. And I have been really fortunate in this economic moment of journalism and the state of journalism to have been able to do that for almost 40 years and make a pretty good living doing it. And I am very aware that I'm fortunate in that regard, and I'm pretty grateful for that. And I can turn a phrase, I can definitely work hard, and I have worked hard. But to be honest with you, it hasn't really felt like working a lot of the time. It's been a passion project, and I haven't really counted the hours. And I wish that for all of you in whatever field you choose to go. But I also have been lucky, truly lucky, good fortune, and have to recognize that too. When Doug and I got back from our trip around the world, I was back at my parents' house, recovering, sleeping, eating especially, really good. And the phone rang. There was no internet in those days, obviously, and so the only way you communicated was by letter or by phone. And it was the sports editor of the San Diego Union, which was the biggest daily paper in San Diego at that time. And I had been working for them part-time during the summers when I was in college at Williams, answering phones. That was my first job in journalism. And my first assignment was to take the daily fish count in San Diego from the charter boats that were going out in the city. And that meant 37 albacore, 25 yellowfin, 10 sheephead. Still remember the names of the fish. This was not glamorous work. This is about as far from all the president's men as you could get. But I remember feeling a completely irrational sense of pride looking at my little list of fish that was on the sports page in tiny print in the Agate section next to the box scores. Totally irrational. But I think I knew then that I was a goner, that journalism was going to be my thing. So basically, after I did the fish count, I got back to answering the phones. And then that year when I came back from the trip with Doug, when the phone rang, the sports editor from San Diego was calling because there had been an internship, paid internship in San Diego that had just opened up. And the guy who was going to take it, I don't know if any of you follow ESPN, Jeremy Schaap was the guy who had taken this internship, but he couldn't do it, so he backed out of it. And my sports editor was kind of at the last minute looking for someone to take this job. And he said, well, you interested? And I said, well, of course, I just got back. I'd love to talk about it. And he goes, well, have you written anything about sports lately? I said, well, I've been traveling, and I never worked for the Williams Record, actually. But I did write for the Sports Information when I was at Williams. So he said, well, bring me the articles. So I stacked up my Sports Information stuff with the purple letterhead and put it in my list. And I said, well, I also, it's not about sports, but I kept a journal when I was traveling. He goes, bring that in too. So I took the journal and the Sports Information stuff into the office. A couple of days later, I got a call and called me in for an interview. I ended up getting the internship. Amazing timing. 3 months of internship. At the very end, at the San Diego paper, one of the sports staffers ended up leaving, and the job opened up. I applied for it, and I got it. So I ended up starting my career at a pretty major sports daily or majors daily, which is just something that doesn't happen very often. And I also got lucky because the sports editor who called was a guy named Barry Lorge, who was a Harvard grad. He was a guy who had covered tennis for the Washington Post. And Barry was a great kind of bear of a guy. And if you worked with Barry, you knew how painful writing could be. Even though he loved what he was doing, writing for him always felt like it was drawing blood when you watched him work. Just every word, he sweated over it. But he was a wonderful, generous guy. And one of the most generous things he did for me was in 1990, after I'd been there a couple of years, he was heading to Wimbledon and he had to change his plans. And so he said, Chris, I know you love tennis. I know you play it. Would you be interested in going to Wimbledon? I know how most of us would answer that question. So I definitely answered the question that way. I ended up going. I had been a junior tennis player, I had been a high school tennis player, and I had been a college tennis player with limited success. But I think being limited really helped me as a writer. I think it helped me understand how amazing these guys really were. I had tried to hit these shots that they hit and made it look so easy. I had double faulted on match point against Amherst. So I remember that still. So I knew what they were going through. I knew how hard a game could be mentally like that. So I think I was able to translate that into my writing a lot. There's a lot of empathy and personal pain that went into that. So I went off to Wimbledon, 1990. I'll test your tennis trivia. I ended up watching Martina Navratilova win her 9th Wimbledon title. Just a luminous, incandescent personality on and off the court. Just got hooked on grass court tennis when the ball made no sound when it bounced. Amazing. A couple months later, I got sent to the US Open. And there was an American teenager with a big serve who ended up running the table and winning the title. Beat everybody. Pete Sampras. Became one of the greatest players of all time. So I was hooked, totally hooked. But San Diego wasn't really a place where you could do international sport and tennis regularly, and that was what I wanted to do. So I ended up getting lucky again. My wife, as I said, is French. We were engaged to be married, and I decided to move to Paris to learn the language, more or less, and to freelance and do sports and other stuff in Europe. And a lot of people had tried to do this, especially in sports, and it just wasn't that much work, it wasn't that much to do. But at that moment, just by chance, maybe you'll recall this, the Olympics used to be every 4 years. You have the Winter Games in February, and you have the Summer Games in the summer. Well, right around that time when I went over there, they went to every 2 years. They split the Winter and the Summer Games. And in my time as a younger person, Olympics were a huge deal in this country. Coming out of the Cold War, just a massive sort of focus on it. And there was a huge amount of interest, and there was also this little sporting event called the World Cup of Soccer coming to the U.S. in 1994. So those three things combined, suddenly there was a lot of interest from major daily papers in the U.S. and covering more sports in Europe. So I was in my house in Paris, newly married, no job, get a call in the evening, and it was the New York Times. I thought it was a joke. And he said, Chris Clary, would you be interested in going to Germany in a couple of days and writing a story about figure skating for us? I'd never covered any figure skating, but it was like yes, yes, and yes. So I caught the night train to Germany to save them money. I don't think I slept. Went through all my interview questions like 3 or 4 different times. Interviewed this Isabelle and Paul Duchesnay, who were a Canadian ice dancing team. Wrote the story, came back. And that's kind of how things started. I got through that one, no corrections. It's always a good sign at the New York Times. And then ended up in 1993 signing a contract with them to be their European sports correspondent, which was more like being an international global sports correspondent. Got sent, with the soccer coming up, I got sent to Morocco, got sent to Senegal, got sent to Cameroon, got sent to Qatar, and didn't see a woman on the streets for 3.5 weeks for a soccer tournament there. It had North Korea, South Korea, Iran, and Iraq all involved. So it was like writing about geopolitics and sports. And then you realized how much breadth there was in all that. So that's kind of how things built. So it was right place, right time, for sure, but also right horse. As you all know, from all generations, media, print media especially, has really suffered globally and in this country in a big way. And the New York Times, managed to bend but not break. Maybe some of you who are younger won't remember this or won't even believe this, but the New York Times was in big danger, in big peril. Back in 2009, they had to take a loan of over $250 million from a Mexican tech tycoon named Carlos Slim just to keep the paper afloat, keep it going. Carlos Slim took a stake in the paper. A few years after that, they sold the Boston Globe, which they had bought for over $1 billion, for about $100 million. Took a huge loss on it. Times were tough, morale was low, there was a lot of doubt about the future of the paper. But what changed? They went all in on digital subscriptions after kind of doing it in a kind of a halfway way for a long time. And they determined that was the only way they were going to survive. And it worked, with a lot of help from Donald Trump, who boosted the New York Times readership considerably during his time. Not for always the best reasons, but nonetheless, interest really spiked. And things are not perfect there by any means. There's tension between the union and management now over wages and kind of sharing the wealth of this renaissance. But it is definitely galloping now, the horse, for sure. And they have over 10 million digital subscribers now. And you walk into the newsroom in New York, and the place has its swagger back. But sadly, that is a major and huge exception. The media business is hurting. You all, just like me, you probably love writing, you love reporting, but it is an increasingly tenuous profession. And I think we're going to need the next generation, that's your generation, to find a better way and some better solutions for it to work. I feel like, in general, around the world, when you travel around, it's sort of the same story everywhere. People in all these different cultures don't want to pay often or very much for quality independent journalism. They don't mind paying a little bit for a few, but not across the board. And the need is huge, as you will see when you go back into your communities. Local, regional, national, international. Democracy runs on watchdogs. And right now the watchdogs are pretty wounded across all those levels. There are a lot of news deserts out there. The New York Times looks great. The Wall Street Journal looks great. The Economist looks great. The Atlantic looks great. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, and then below it's all melting. So I really hope as you go out into your choices in your life that you think about that. And I think there's a way to make a difference. But I kind of feel like me being up here, my generation, late 50s, and taking the opportunity to be able to give you a lot of advice about things, I feel a little bit conflicted about that. So I feel in some ways, my generation and the generation that preceded me did not do a great job of figuring this out. We didn't make the right choices at the right time. We ended up sacrificing a lot of time and lost a lot of time as things like Google and other elements of society arose, and we faltered. So we need fresh legs and we need fresh thinking. Maybe some of it will be done by ChatGPT. We will see. But I think there's no question about it. But I would say that I do feel like I can say that I still believe in the truth, and I hope you do too. There's a lot of talk about that there is no truth or there are various truths. I believe that there is truth. And I think the truth, whether you're covering sports or politics or the war in Ukraine, it's worth fighting and writing for. And I'd also say, as we round this up, that I think I've been lucky, no doubt about it. I've had breaks at the right time. But I also think that you can plan for your good luck. You don't know when it's going to come. You're not sure exactly when that moment when things are going to pay off for you is going to arrive. But there's a much better chance of it working if you're on a path that's the right path for you before it happens. And when I was in Europe, when all that stuff changed, it was not a coincidence that I was there. I was kind of following this thing that I was feeling inside, telling me it was the right way to go, the right approach, even though there wasn't a clear path ahead at the time. So how do you do this? I think you do it by trusting your instincts and by cultivating and learning to trust your inner voice, especially when it's cranking up the volume on you. I know mine was shouting at me when I was young. What was it shouting? Some might call it trivial, some might not, but mine was shouting. Writing, sports, international, tennis, Olympics. Those were things that were in my head. I almost couldn't get them out of my head. It was something very, very strong. And I think I knew that if I followed those things, the sacrifices wouldn't feel like sacrifices to me. And so I ask all of you who are winning awards tonight, is your inner voice shouting at you? And I hope it is, because you know what? It makes it a lot easier, to be honest with you. It's a world full of choices, a world full of options out there. So if it's shouting, you should be thankful. It gives you a clear path forward. And if it is shouting, I really, really hope you act on it. So thank you. We have time for some questions. Yeah, if you guys have anything you want to ask me, Federer or whatever, you feel free. I'm happy to answer a few. We got some time, Dixie. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have a favorite tennis match that you've covered?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, the question was, do I have a favorite tennis match that I've covered? How many people in this room, just out of curiosity, follow tennis regularly? Okay, so not everybody. One thing I did forget to mention was when I was in San Diego, when I was in that internship, one of the first stories that I wrote was about Dick Farley, over there in the corner. And he answered my phone call. He was very nice. So thanks, Coach. Good stuff. Tennis match. It's funny. You could say the most amazing match that I covered was clearly the 2008 Wimbledon final. Federer and Nadal. Just amazing back and forth. Huge amount of expectation for that match going into it. So that's what it takes to get a great, great tennis match. You got to have this sort of the pump has to get primed. Those guys were going toward that moment for ages. Nadal had just crushed Federer in the French Open final, embarrassed him. I think Roger won 4 games. So he had won Wimbledon 5 times in a row, but everybody knew he was vulnerable. The match was super hyped. A lot of times in sports that doesn't pay off. In this case, it was worth the hype. So that would be the match that's obviously the one that made the biggest impact, except it happened on a really tight deadline, so it was kind of nasty having to write that one. And it was really dark by the end, too. Flashlights going off. There was no roof then. So you could barely see. So Roger was complaining, and everybody thought he was whining after he lost, but actually it was really hard to see the ball. But I would say, actually, in some ways, for me, the match that I probably enjoyed the most was a few years earlier, when Roger was just emerging. He played a Russian guy full of swagger named Marat Safin, who was just a charismatic player, completely tempestuous, couldn't control himself at all. But he managed to control himself and play his best tennis in this match, Australian Open semifinal. It was like 2 guys named Thor just throwing thunderbolts at each other. And it was a match that people probably don't remember on the short list, but when you were in that stadium that night, the intensity was just nonstop for 4.5 hours. And even Federer, you could see him sweat. So that match is one of the ones I'll never forget. Who else got a question? Anybody else? Yeah?
You have a favorite tennis player on the tour right now?
Well, I just talked about him once. I mentioned him once on the way in. I mean, I love Nadal and Djokovic. I love Iga Swiatek, who's #1 in the world from Poland now. But the guy I can't take my eyes off is a guy named Carlos Alcaraz, if you haven't seen him play. He's 19 years old. He's Spanish. Can hit every shot in the book. He is explosive, amazing physical talent, and he's a nice guy. I went to Alicante, where he trains, for a New York Times story a couple years ago. Watched him practice, which is usually kind of boring to watch players practice. Him was not boring. Everything was all action, acrobatic, in the air. Have you seen him play?
I watched him practice in Miami a couple weeks ago.
Did you have the same impression?
Yeah, it was ridiculous.
He said he watched him practice in Miami. But this is a guy, he's worth your ticket, and if he stays healthy, which is a big question mark because he's all over the court, putting himself in crazy gymnastic positions, and he's already gotten hurt a little bit. But he is well worth your time and jet lag to see. Come on, guys, gotta have a couple more. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, for reasons I still can't figure out, a lot of people in the tennis world don't love Novak Djokovic, and you said you met him when he was age 17. You just followed him. I was wondering if you could talk about some of your experiences with him, and just give us your spiel.
You guys all hear the question? Yeah, Jake and I talked about this over pizza a little while ago. Yeah, Djokovic he's a complex character. Having covered all these guys in this generation, Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, Andy Murray, guys like Stan Wawrinka, Djokovic is hands down the most interesting guy in the game, without a doubt. He's the most interesting interview. He challenges you in ways other people that don't when you're being interviewed. Likes to hear the sound of his own voice. I was telling Jake I went to interview him in Monte Carlo before the pandemic. Got a chance. You have to kind of wait for your opportunities to talk to these top players or top athletes. But he gave me some time and said, can you be in Monte Carlo in a few days? I was like, okay, well, I'll try to get there. So I got there and showed up at the office where the interview was. And I sat down and he goes, I am so glad you made it. And he starts talking. And he literally talked, I timed it on my tape recorder, 15 minutes without stopping. I just arrived and sat down. And he's going off on strategy and what he learned from the final he just played and the mental game and everything else. And basically, I finally got a word in after 15 minutes. And I didn't get much of a word in, but I got in more. But he had things he wanted to say. And that's the way Novak is. He's a passionate guy. He definitely has made some mistakes in his life. Obviously, the decision he made not to get vaccinated, you can call it irresponsible, you can call it brave, you can call it all kinds of things, but it's a polarizing choice. He is carrying the weight of a very small country on his shoulders. He means so much in Serbia. All those guys mean a lot in their country. Nadal means a huge amount in Spain. Federer is Switzerland for a lot of people. Andy Murray is Scotland to a lot of people. But Djokovic, because of Serbia's background and his politics, is somebody who plays a huge, huge role in that country. And he knows it, and I think he feels that pressure day to day. But he's somebody who, Roger gets a lot of credit for being a polyglot and a talented linguist, but Djokovic blows him out of the water. The guy just basically can speak to everybody in their native language. They don't always like what he says, but that's the case. But the reason why I think he suffered in the popularity contest a little bit is because of what we talked about, the fact that he came along at a time when Serbia was a pariah, and he also came along at a time when Federer and Nadal was already a great dynamic and a great storyline. It was already well established, and then this guy came and messed with the storyline. He could handle it. He could beat them both, and kind of do it in a way that showed he wasn't afraid of them. And I think people had already chosen their camps, and now they had to choose another one. So it was an awkward thing in that way. Anything else? Yeah, back in the back.
Who in your mind is the future of American tennis?
Who in my mind is the future of American tennis? On the men's side or the women's side or both? And the men's side, things are pretty good right now in a way. You got a bunch of guys in the top 20 and 30 who are pretty young, 25 years and younger. The one guy I think probably has the biggest upside in men's tennis is a guy who can't play right now, who's hurt his wrist. A guy named Sebastian Korda, who is the son of Peter Korda, who won a Grand Slam title for the Australian Open for the Czech Republic. And his mom was a very good top 30 player, and you may have heard of his sisters, Jessica Korda and Nelly Korda. Who knows them? Anybody? Two of the top golfers in women's golf in the world. Nelly has won the Olympic gold medal in women's golf last year. Amazing sports family. 3 kids, and they went 3 for 3 on the talent. But Seb is about 6'5", kind of a poker face guy, very languid appearance, but the guy's an amazing ball striker, and all the top guys are already afraid of him. He almost beat Djokovic in Australia. So I think he's the guy, longer term, I would keep an eye on. I also got to respect Taylor Fritz, 25 years old. He's a guy who steadily has improved every year. He's in the top 10 now, established himself. So everybody's been sort of saying Taylor's going to peak, and he just never seems to peak. So I keep an eye on him too, because he's got a fire within him that has lit him up. And women's tennis, I don't know. Coco Gauff, who many of you may have heard of, very talented player, but seems to be having trouble with certain shots in her arsenal, finding a way to be able to really produce them under the greatest pressure with her second serve and her forehand. Maybe too nice a person, deep down, great person, really a lot of depth to her, but I think sometimes lacks the killer instinct that can be helpful in tennis. So I don't know if there's a clear future great. You'd have to go with Coco, I think, at this point still. She's only 18 years old, but we'll see. Anybody else? Yeah?
What manufacturer makes the best racket?
That's kind of a loaded question. I don't know. As journalists at the time, we're not allowed to even mention the brand of racket in our stories unless it's relevant. But all I can say is that the players themselves, you think they would be the ones that you should be watching what they choose. And some of the smaller brands, Technifiber. You got guys like Medvedev and Swiatek using that. They've had some success with that racket. That's one that's definitely on the rise. The Babolats are still really good, but I guess the one that you see people using besides Wilson's the most, and maybe it isn't so front and center in the US, is our Yonex rackets. This generation of Yonex rackets are really, really high quality, and a lot of pros have done a lot of racket testing. They do it now with multi-cameras and check all your RPMs on spin and check your speeds and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of players end up picking Yonex. So that's all I know on that. Yeah?
In your biography, you talk a lot about the big three of Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic. Why do you feel that their story was so compelling?
Well, I think, men's tennis, we look at the history of men's tennis and sports in general, what gets our attention week to week? Somebody can be a big personality, that helps. But really what it is, if you like sports, it's rivalries, right? And whatever it is, it's rivalries. You want to see your team go up against another team, or that town's team go up against that town's team. In an individual sport like tennis, it's down to the personalities clashing. And I think we have never seen in the history of professional men's tennis so many great matches happen so often between such a small group of guys. If you go back to my time when we were kids, you had McEnroe and Borg, obviously. Huge interest in that rivalry. Still writing scripts about it and books about it now. But they really only played, basically, I think 20 times in their whole careers. And they didn't last that long. Borg retired at 26. But it was a great rivalry. 1980 Wimbledon final, fantastic match. So there was this tradition. But then along come Federer and Nadal and Djokovic. These guys had played 50 times, most of the time in finals, and often with these amazingly epic matches over a 15-year period. So I think tennis is much bigger globally than it is in our country. It takes up a lot more air and space in countries like France and countries like Germany, countries like the UK because of Wimbledon than it does in the US. So globally, each one of these clashes, each one of these matches took on more and more importance over the years. And people pick their sides, like Jake did with Djokovic. Basically, it's you know who you like, you know who speaks to you, and you get behind him, and then you get a chance to watch him play these all-time greats again and again and again. So Izzy, I think that's what happened. I think that's the reason why that those guys separated themselves. And at the same time, on the women's side of the game, you had this greatness from Serena Williams, amazing talent, but she never really had a rival at her level. So women's tennis had this great superstar, and Venus Williams, her sister, certainly had great success. But Venus and Serena was often a mismatch on the court, and Venus never had the success long-term that Serena did. So women's tennis never had something like men's tennis did. And it could shift, it could happen. Everett and Navratilova back in the day had that. They were able to play many more times even than these guys play in this era, and they created an all-time rivalry, but that's been gone on the women's side for a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah?
I guess on that note, out of those three, who's the GOAT? Can't say it on the record.
I don't believe in goat. I like goat cheese. No, well, goat, greatest of all time. I'm more goat, G-O-T-E, so greatest of the era. You can call that a cop-out, but men's tennis especially has just changed too much. Open era in '68. Before that, too many guys missed too many Grand Slam tournaments. In the '70s and the '80s, the best players didn't play all four. The idea of winning the most majors wasn't even really part of the discussion until Pete Sampras came along in the '90s. So I think, honestly, to go back and sort of compare Rod Laver, who had 2 true Grand Slams, won all 4 majors in the same calendar year, and say he doesn't belong in that debate is just crazy to me. So it's hard, it's not apples to apples. But I think in this era, based on achievement, based on consistency, based on length of answers in press conferences, I got to go with Djokovic. But I got to give Nadal a chance. Nadal can still do it. He's hurting. I'm not sure he'll come back. But if he wins another French Open after his hip injury or wins another major or beats Novak in a big match, then it gets pretty close. And also, I should announce this tonight. My next book's on Nadal. Just signed the contract. So hopefully we'll get a chance to see him play some more before the book comes out. But the reason I'm doing it is because I just still am amazed and think it's insane that somebody can win 14 French Opens. So you can talk what you want about Novak, and his consistency, I think, earns him the GOTE GOAT. But I think in terms of Rafa, no individual achievement can pass 14, maybe in any sport. Yes, President.
I'm curious if you could say something about the difference about writing short to deadline pieces versus writing books. And if you follow the same process, and it's a different kind of deadline. So I'm just curious about your process and sort of how
Yeah. Well, it's intense pain versus extended pain, I guess, right?
I don't do much deadline writing. Actually, I often tell students.
You know, I got to tell you, deadline writing, how much deadline writing you guys do in sports information?
I do a lot for class.
Yeah. How much for Dick do you guys do? How much time do you have after a game's over to file your story?
30 minutes.
Okay. Well, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. I got a few more readers when you file one for the New York Times, so you're feeling some pressure there. But the fact of it is, I would say that deadline writing is a muscle. Maud, I'd say definitely that's the case. I think it's something that the more you do, whether you're a talented writer or not so talented, or whether you're a natural writer or not, the more you do it, you can really get much better at it. And it's also, again, kind of back to what I said at the end of my talk, it's about trusting your instincts. Because honestly, you don't have time to rethink it. You've got to kind of process the game, process what you've done. You're taking maybe notes, you got your idea going in, but you don't have time for your plan B or plan C. There just isn't time for it. It's plan A, it's going to work. You're going to talk to yourself a lot so you know it's going to work, and you're just going to do it. And it's an instinct kind of game. And the more you do it, the more you learn to trust that and you just go with it. Do you write your best story every time? No. But I think it also helps psychologically because you know you did what you could in the time that you had. Which brings us to a book where you have far too much time to say, oh, it should be the best it could ever be. It should be better than I have ever done before. I got to make this special. And sometimes trying too hard doesn't work. So I think that's the challenge when you write a book. And the other thing that I learned, I had written some before, but nothing like the Federer book where it was that detailed. And the Federer book, I had so much information because I'd interviewed him so many times over the years, and he has given so many press conferences and played so many matches. There was just such a wealth of material. So you had to figure out how to boil it down to make it compelling. And the biggest thing I would say is if and when you write a book, maybe some of you already have, structure is king. It is king. Because if you don't do it right, it's kind of like when you do that bowl in ceramics class and you don't make it quite right and you put the high heat on, it's going to crack if it isn't just right. And your structure in your book, probably like a film script, it's very similar. You have got to find a way to put it in place. And with the Federer book, the challenge was basically that I wanted, because he's so global and he's been all over the world with his aura and his career, I wanted to do it by location. I didn't want to do it chronologically. I wanted to have a London chapter, I wanted to have a Paris chapter, a Zurich chapter, whatever it would be, which sounds great because he's global. But the problem is in tennis, what do you do in your career? You play Wimbledon when you're 18 and then you keep playing it every year for 20 plus years. So how do you do your Wimbledon chapter and then not go too far ahead and then get stuck behind? So it was really structurally a challenge. And I had to really think it over a bunch of times. I actually had to start over because I didn't have the structure right the first time. But I would say, honestly, of all the things that I've done in sports writing, it was the most satisfying thing. And also, oddly enough, in this era of instant news and short attention spans allegedly, I get asked about that book every day. And it's been almost 2 years. So people, connect with us with a book, I think, in a way that they don't connect with daily journalism. And I've seen some of my colleagues have just done amazing work in sports, highly detailed, huge time investment in stories. And then in this era, it pops out on the internet digitally for 12 hours on the homepage of the New York Times, and then it's gone. And even though it was, obviously, if it's groundbreaking and changes society, okay, but just an average great newspaper story from my time, it doesn't have much life anymore. So I think it's tough. Whereas a book, because it's going to reach people at different times, it has more. So really satisfying, and we'll see how number 2 goes. But number 1 was the reason. But it was tough. Anybody else?
Certain people in sports commentary, sports journalism, or sports broadcasting seem to want to brand themselves as a colorful personality or having a colorful turn of phrase. I go back to a guy named Jim Murray. I don't know if you ever read him.
Of course. Gentlemen, start your coffins.
Full of metaphors and funny similes, and and then I think of someone like Howard Cosell, obviously branded himself in this colorful, provocative way. I'm just wondering two things. First of all, have you ever tried to brand yourself in that way or in some way, or what you, and then secondly, are you a fan of any particular sports writer or sports journalism for their colorful, individualized way of doing that work?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't think I have any particular voice. I think you see that still a lot on the local level in particular. I mean, I'm in Boston a lot of the time. Got a guy who's a columnist there like Dan Shaughnessy, somebody who's like him or don't like him. I know, Doug, you have your moments, but he's a guy who has got a strong voice. You can feel it. I think when you dig into those local teams, that sort of thing is definitely the case, where you get that kind of chance to connect with people and develop this real voice connection with your public. But it's a tougher game now, and we talked about this a little bit at dinner already. I think the hard thing is you have your main work, which is your articles and your writing for the website or for the newspaper, and then you have social media. And honestly, those are just two often conflictual things. Because if you're writing about sports, in my case at the New York Times, you're trying to be balanced unless you're labeled clearly as a columnist. You're not trying to like spout opinions and bring too much attention to yourself. You're trying to tell a good story and do it in a balanced way. But yeah, social media is all about a take. It's all about being allegedly clever. It's about having a persona. And that can run you into a lot of trouble because you're tempted to be much glibber, I think, on social media than you are in your regular reporting. And it's gotten a lot of reporters today in some trouble because they end up not being clear on where those boundaries should be. And in the early years, it was the Wild West. I mean, there was no restrictions. Nothing was written down. It's like, oh, there's Twitter. Go out and do it. We're not going to pay you extra for it, but you go out and do that Twitter thing and link to your stories and all that. And journalists jumped right in. But there were really no guardrails. How do you keep your objectivity? And once you've done something that sort of puts you in a certain camp or a certain place, you can't walk that back very easily, which is why journalists, good journalism has ethics policies and why you need them. And now there are social media policies in place. But I think that's the challenge today, is for people to try to walk those two different planks, if you will. But there are some great writers out there for sure, people who are real stylists. You're seeing a lot more now in kind of individual silos. The great general sports writers like Jim Murray, you mentioned. I was telling Dick and I were both laughing at his line about the Indy 500, right? Gentlemen, start your coffins, That was his lead to his story. Sounds almost a little bit trite today, but it was like the time, and that's the way he wrote. It was clever and quick. A guy named Bud Collins covered tennis in this era for a long time. Very colorful, amazing analogies, almost too much to read sometimes, but that's the way it was. But now I think it's people who can really dive into a sport and give you a great take on that are the ones that come to mind. So, there's a great guy in golf, guy's from Williams College actually. Anybody know Dylan? I've been really impressed with Dylan's work. I think Dylan's got a great future in sports writing, and he's doing some great work in the golf space. And I know he wrote a nice book already. If you guys aren't following him, get your purple pride out and do it because he's very good. Everybody good? Thank you so much. Real pleasure.
We're going to wrap up now, but I'd like you all to know that tomorrow from 12:30 p.m. to 1:30 p.m., Chris will be signing the Roger Federer book at the Williams Bookstore on Spring Street, so stop by. Thank you all for helping us honor our outstanding contributors to Sports Information this year. Hope to see you all back here next April. Have a good night. Thank you.